Discussing cold immersion as a therapy for weight loss. Let's assume we have two boxes. On the one side we have this box, on the other side we have this box. Now these two boxes are connected via tubes, and one of these boxes is the cooling box and the other one is the heating box. Now as energy is transferred from this box to this box, the energy is basically gone from here. So the energy needs to come from somewhere. So now if you idealize a human that is in there and can breathe, obviously, then if this human is in water, and the benefit of water is that the skin basically gives off heat and the water takes the heat very easily. Compare this to you grabbing a metal plate, for example, compared to you grabbing something else like clothes, for example, that insulate more. So there is a little bit of heat transfer going on in between the human and the water. Now, since humans also can be in water, at least up to the neck, and if they are not up to the neck, then obviously you can just have a breathing mechanism. This is called diving. But if we put any human in water that is colder than he or she basically is, or the skin basically is, then there is a certain heat transfer that is probably occurring. Now, the heat is basically then spread evenly in this water. If we now then connect these tubes to this other thing, that then ideally is the cooling mechanism. Then the heat that is given off, if the box is completely perfectly insulated with a layer outside of this box, then every piece of heat, every piece of very small movement, because heat seems to be actually movement, called Brownian motion. So basically the molecules and the atoms and so on, they move at a very small scale, and this is actually heat. So you could also call it kinetic energy. And then on one side, of course, here we have maybe the cooling water that is popped up, because also hotter water, I think, is, I don't know exactly, but at least within a certain area of water being at a certain temperature, I think water also rises, so the warmer temperature might be above. This of course is dependent on the density of water. Now at 4 degrees Celsius, water is actually the densest, so there is a anomaly in water. But for the purpose of this argument here, let's just say, okay, here we have the cooling that is transferred. So here is the basically more heat, and then the more heat is transferred here, and then the cool water is transferred in here again. I'm just realizing that I might have I should maybe have bought the other pens that were red and blue, and then I could have a very nice image here. So the cooling mechanism is kind of the opposite. It is something that needs obviously also to have now heat transfer to occur. So on the back of a refrigerator you usually find a grid like this that is usually increasing the surface area of the pipes, for example, with a grid. Now this grid, if exposed to basically another temperature, is then giving off heat. Only if the outside environment is a little bit cooler. So therefore, if you basically take anything and expose it to something that is cooler or warmer, there will be an exchange of heat going on. You could also call it heat or temperature, or cold or temperature. And the more surface area is in between those two, and the less insulation is in between those two, and the less insulation, for example, is also between your hand and the water, the faster this heat transfer might occur, or in this case will occur. Now, this is already going into the constraints now. If we have a human and the human is in there, then now ideally if we assume that the human has only one goal, an organism in general only has one goal, is to first survive and then maybe have the other goals the mechanisms usually have, or achieve the other objectives or reach the other objectives. And the first one is obviously survive. So if the human in there wants to survive, and if the body wants to survive, then it would make sense to produce the required heat in order to stay in here. So now it is to discuss that there is obviously a maximum amount of heat per unit of time. You could also call it heat performance, that anything like a human, for example, is able to produce. And also different humans will be able to produce different kinds of heat performances. Mostly, if the human is standing still, the heat will probably be produced by brown fat cells. These are basically fat cells that produce heat. There are also beige fat cells, there are also white fat cells. The white fat cells are the ones that are usually bad, or described as bad. The brown fat cells are basically kind of thermodynamically active, you could say. And the beige fat cells, I think, can be either. I just opened up a source. Brown fat cell converts chemical energy to heat to protect against cold water. In the brown fat cells we find mitochondria, small lipid droplets, and the nucleus. So it looks like this. There's the nucleus in the middle, and then we have mitochondria and also small fat droplets in here. These are the fat droplets. Now, the beige fat cell is basically the same, but the fat droplets are a little bit bigger. And then you might have guessed it, the white fat cell is again the same, just with maybe less mitochondria and a big fat droplet. Or droplet. Now, here is the whole idea. Because we already have these refrigerating mechanisms, these cooling mechanisms, we actually can kind of control how much heat this person in here should produce. And also, obviously, we can control how long this person stays in there. Now, fat loss is basically the loss of the fat in the fat cells, either in the brown fat cells or the beige fat cells or the white fat cells, but I don't know if the white fat cells actually can produce that much heat. They have mitochondria in there, but probably the brown fat cells are the best. So let's just assume, for the sake of this argument, that the brown fat cells actually make all the heat. Now, if you expose a person to the cold more and more, beige fat cells seemingly seem to transfer into or convert into brown fat cells more. So the number of brown fat cells can apparently be increased. I got the whole idea in the following scenario. I want to have a cold tub somewhere in my apartment. Why in my apartment? Because there are no other places where I could have it. So therefore currently I'm thinking, here is the cold tub. If I am in the cold tub, I have to cool it somehow, because that's obviously the whole reason of the cold tub. So therefore, again, a cooling mechanism has to be invented. Now, the fridge is already a cooling mechanism. It basically takes energy out of the inners of the fridge and just puts it out with, again, cables onto the back of the fridge, where you again have this transfer thing here. Now, if you put yourself in there, then you are obviously the main thing that increases the water temperature. Again, only if ideally insulated. So of course there was also, the water temperature will also increase if I put in ice, for example, just from the normal air temperature. But since air is far more insulating, I would say, than water, then you are basically the main source of heat. Now, if I put myself in there, then again, it's the same scenario. So what these ice tubs and cooling or cold tubs have is a refrigerator, basically, a cooling unit. Here, for example, we can see such a tub that is sold on Alibaba, and this seems to be maybe also the source for the edge theory tub that is very similar. And here we have the cooling mechanism. We have basically the tubes that go from here to here, and this is the cooling thing. So it takes the heat and then it immerses or distributes the heat, not immerses, but distributes the heat then just into the air. Now let's get to the logistics of this. Fat, if found in nutrition, has usually 9 kilocalories per gram. Now this is almost twice as dense as the 4 kilocalories per gram we find in carbohydrates and also protein, even though there is a slight deviation. Usually it is just rounded up to 9 and 4 as the numbers. So this means fat in total is almost twice as dense, even more than twice as dense in terms of the calories. So now, or in terms of the energy it can make. Now, if fat is again stored in the body, because there are mitochondria in there and also the nucleus with the DNA and maybe a few other things, the fat that is stored in a body usually has, maybe also just on average, because we have different fat cells, is 7 kilocalories per gram. So now, if we again assume that a human that is stored in a box, that is a refrigerator basically, a cooling, basically just an ice bath you could say, or a cold bath, is giving off the energy. If then again this is ideally insulated, then the energy that goes out of the human has to come out usually out of fat cells, maybe out of muscles. But it doesn't really matter because, I mean, if it is less efficiently produced than with the fat cells, if we just assume the fat cells produce energy with 7 kilocalories per gram of fat cell, then the next thing we need to know is the definition of a calorie. Very conveniently, the calorie is the heat energy, or the equivalent thereof, needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 gram Celsius, by 1 degree Celsius, which is equivalent to 4.18 kilojoules, or about 4.2. No, it's 4,000. It's about 4.2 joules. Now, the thing that kind of tripped me off is that calories are usually actually not really calories, but kilocalories. So, kilo stands for 1,000. This means if you just have like 7 kilocalories, that's actually 7,000 calories. But of course, life is short, so therefore we just usually say calories. Whenever we mean kilocalories. Now, for the sake of the argument, let's just assume, I mean, it doesn't really matter what we define, but let's just say we have this human, and the human is within either, let's say, 100 liters of water immersed. This is probably not really as much as we need, or maybe it could be as much as we need, because if you assume a small tub, I saw these smaller tubs on Amazon because I searched them for myself, then these have 150 to 250 liters in there, and then you can fit in there. Maybe your head doesn't fit in here. But the 100 is very nice because 100% obviously. Now, if we assume the 100 liters in there are raised by 1 degree Celsius, which obviously is not the same as 1 degree Fahrenheit because they have a conversion rate. But let's just stay with Kelvin and Celsius, because Kelvin and Celsius actually have the same measurement amounts. So 1 Kelvin is also the same kind of as 1 Celsius, despite the two scales not being aligned. So 100 liters are also 100 kilograms. If it now takes 1 kilocalorie to heat up 1 degree, to heat up 1 gram of water 1 degree, and since water almost closely has the density of 1, so 1 gram per 1 milliliter, then we now can calculate how much calories the body loses if we again assume it comes either from fat or from a less efficient source. Because if the source is, for example, muscle movement, shivering, then obviously the muscle is also moving. So in addition, there is also the water resistance that therefore prohibits the movement, and that there is also gravity, so therefore the movement also comes at an additional cost. So it can only be kind of less efficient than the 7 kilocalories per gram if we assume it is so efficient that it outputs exactly what the actual caloric density is. So we take the 100 liters or kilograms multiplied by factor 1,000 because of the kilograms, and then we have a number which has 5 zeros, and this number with 5 zeros now is 100,000. So 100,000 is the number of grams in a 100 liter kilogram box of water. Now, if we want to raise 100,000 grams of water by 1 gram, by 1 degree Celsius, then obviously it's just multiplied by 1. So we have 100,000 calories. Now, conveniently, this here is actually, again, calories. It's not kilocalories. So what we have to do is we have to cut out 3 zeros. So in our example, it works out very nicely that the amount of water that is in there that has to be heated up is equivalent to the calories that are output to increase the heat of the water by 1 degree Celsius, which is, in short, the 100. So we need 100 kilocalories to increase the water temperature of a 100 liter tank, in our example, as efficiently as possible, or as efficiently as the body can produce it, by 1 degree. Now, this is just one point in time, you could say, because let's just assume this is instant, because otherwise we would have to have some kind of time frame. The next limit that is now here is the limit of how much this refrigerator or cooling unit can blow off in terms of energy. So basically, the energy is taken out of the human at the rate of, it's not a rate, because we should just assume, first of all, it's instant. The rate is actually kind of determined by the maximum rate the human is able to produce without dying, or without any severe damage, or also without any severe short, mid to long-term damage. If we just assume this should be a therapy, then this should be just something that does not damage the human in any kind of way. Now, obviously, there needs to be, if this would be a therapy setup, kind of, and you would just go there and let's say you are in cold water immersed and you are in there for maybe 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. I mean, obviously this all is kind of already occurring in certain gyms that already have cold plunges, and maybe also people have cold plunges at home. But the question is, what is the limit of this? And this is kind of the question, the bigger question I wanted to ask in this video. What would be the limit? And if we take a human, for example, that is originally 100 kilograms. Why 100? Because it's a nice number. But he is overweight. So he's not overweight, he's actually overfat. So he has 25 kilograms too much. It doesn't matter what reference we use. We just say the ideal weight of this human is 100 kilograms. So that's the ideal. So therefore we do not have to discuss all the different possible failures and inaccuracies of the measurements and the different things we have, the different indexes like BMI, for example. We just say the 25 kilograms is too much and that's the ideal weight. So what this means obviously is that we have 25 kilograms of fat too much. We just don't assume it's muscle, we just don't assume the organ weight has increased by 25%, it is just the fat. Let's make it even easier. Let's not assume it's 25, but it's 10. Why? Because then we don't have to calculate it much and we can all do it in our head. So let's just say we have a human and the human needs to lose, or let's just say 1, because then everybody can multiply it in their head. A human with 100 kilograms of ideal weight wants to lose 1 kilogram of fat through cold therapy. So I just looked up maximum heat production rate human, and what I found is that here one source says it's about, for indoor activities, a human produces about 110 watts. But the basic idea, and everybody who already has done a cold plunge probably already found out, that if you do a cold plunge, then probably the body produces more heat. Also after the cold plunge and after a cold shower, the body is actually probably able to produce more heat, otherwise it wouldn't. It needs to be able to produce more heat, because if you have water on your skin, then it obviously evaporates, which then causes again heat loss. So there needs to be a production rate higher. But again, for the sake of the argument, we just assume the maximum amount of wattage the human is able to produce in terms of heat is 100. So the question now is, how long does it take a human with 1 kilogram of fat overweight with 100 watts, which is then the rate at which the heat basically evaporates, or not evaporates, but goes into the water, and then obviously the cooling mechanism also needs to be able to blow off 100 watts of heat energy. And again, 100 watts is basically now just the energy per unit of time. This is performance. Performance is energy per unit of time. Very conveniently now, if we take 100 joules, now joules and calories we just assume are transferring at, or maybe let's just do the actual values here. What 100 watts means is 100 joules are produced every single second. This could be either for running, this could also be for something else. 100 joules per second is 100 watts. Now, because we measure the energy the body uses for fat in calories, we have to divide this. So we divide 100 by 4.2, which is a rough estimate of the conversion rate, as you heard earlier. And this now gives us 23 calories. So if we assume the maximum heat production rate of a human is 100 watts, then this results in 23 calories per second. But these are now the normal calories. These are not the kilocalories. So kilocalories are for us normal calories, but in physics it's just that is a kilo missing actually. I'm already beginning to see this with these calculations. It probably will take quite a little bit of time to burn off a few calories through heat. Now if we have 23 calories per second, then we now need to find out how much calories the 1 kilogram of fat has. Now the 1 kilogram of fat is again 1000 grams. You might see the similar pattern: kilocalories, kilograms. So kilo just stands again for 1000. So we have 100, we have not 100, but 1000 grams of fat stored in the body at a rate that gives us 7 calories. No, 7 kilocalories here, because we again use the normal one. The normal one, which is the common, the one that is used in common language. We have 7 kilocalories per gram. So this equals in 7,000 total calories. If I'm not mistaken, 7,000 kcal. Now we could go both ways. It obviously doesn't really matter. We just take the 7,000 and we divide it by 23. Now this gives us, in short, 304. Now, what is this now, this 304? It's seconds. We would need, and this now sounds ridiculous, I think. So, the problem is that we have 1 kilo too much. So it's actually not 304 seconds, but I think 1,000 times that much. I'm actually too incapable of solving calculations to solve the problem of this being here down here. Oh, I do realize now. So we have calories here in the nominator. We have also calories here, but here the calories and the second is basically a sub thing here. So this again goes up. So we have T equals T for time equals 700,000 divided by 23, which equals 3. Nope. It's 7 million calories divided by 23 calories. 7 million calories, as it. This is the 1 kilogram of body fat at the caloric density or the energetic density of 7 kilocalories per gram, and we divide this then by the maximum rate we assume the human body is able to produce in terms of heat without dying of 100 watts, because it is also able to produce this at room temperature. Then we result in about 300,000 seconds. Now 300,000 very conveniently is dividable by 6 or 60, so we have minutes, and if we divide this by 60 then we have 5,000 minutes. 5,000 minutes is still a lot, so we divide it maybe not by hours, because I think it makes more sense to display it in minutes here. So now the obvious question is, do I want to be this long in the hot tub or in the cold tub? It's 83 hours. 83 hours at the given rates you would have to spend in the hot tub to heat up basically yourself or the water, and then the heat would be transferred through the tubes, and so it would be going into here. Now the question is obviously, how much more can we do? If a human is able to produce already at room temperature 100 watts of energy and give off 100 watts of energy, so basically if you have a room with 10 people and everybody gives off 100 watts, then it's equivalent to a radiator giving off 100, not 100, but 1000 watts of heat every single second. Not every single second, but joules of heat every single second, or watts. So you could also think of this whole system as you jumping into this one box, and then out of this other box the cooling unit is basically evaporating the fat you lose. At least in terms of energy, if both are ideally insulated and we have no heat loss or energy transfer lost in the box, in the insulation of the box, in the insulation of the tubes, and so on and so forth. But everything in here that is an efficiency is only not an efficiency in terms of the fat loss. Of course, then the fat is producing heat at a less efficient rate or less efficiently, but that's only good for us because we actually want to lose the fat. So compare this to you driving the car. It's actually the reversed scenario, because in the car you want to have as much coverage or mileage as possible from a single liter of oil, for example, whereas in here you actually want to lose the fat. I mean, your body might not want to, but that's an entirely different story. So to only lose the 1 kilogram of fat that we just assumed, the person at the given rates would have to be in there for 83 hours. Now, if you divide this maybe into a weekly session, for example, or let's just say we do 1 hour every single day, then it still will take 11 weeks or 3 months. Now, there are also anomalies like Wim Hof. The question is, can everybody be as good in cold exposure as Wim Hof is? And I think it would be reasonable to assume that you can at least double or maybe triple or maybe 5-fold or maybe 10-fold your heat exposure, not your heat exposure, but your maximum heat production rate, compared to you standing at 20 degrees Celsius or at room temperature indoors. Now, given that everybody already produces about 100 watts at room temperature, also normal humans, this is basically a safe rate. And this also now is basically the reason why it doesn't work normally if we just assume the 100 watts, because it's just too long of time. Nobody wants to be in there that long. And also, it is quite uncomfortable. So because it is so uncomfortable, there is an argument to be made. It is uncomfortable because of the required heat production, which maybe exceeds what the body is able to produce. So therefore, the less comfortable it is, the more heat the body has probably to produce, or the more the body is at its limit in heat production. If we, for example, assume that you can 10-fold your heat production rate and build up 10 times as amount of many fat cells or brown fat cells. For example, you can build up apparently brown fat cells if you are able to produce more brown fat cells, or to convert more brown fat cells, or to convert more beige fat cells into brown fat cells, and you are able to suddenly produce 1000 watts, then this scenario looks already quite different. Instead of 83 hours, it would be 8.3 hours. Instead of the 5,000 minutes, it would only be 500 minutes. And 500 minutes now is already something that is reasonable, I would say. Not maybe for the pure purpose of fat loss, but maybe I think I do need more than this, because otherwise. Now, if we just assume the 500 minutes now, and let's also assume you are able to buy one of these tubs, you are able to place it within your shower, and then you can just use it within the shower. Maybe that's a scenario, or you have a garden where you can place one of these tubs. Then in order to now lose at 1000 watts the 1 kilogram of fat, you somehow have to distribute the 500 minutes. So if we just say you are able to stay in there for maybe, because you want to really lose the fat, you stay in there for 10 minutes a day, which would maybe be possible. So Joe Rogan, for example, I think sometimes does 10 minutes or sometimes even 15 minutes. The maximum I was ever in ice cold water, so water at basically the freezing point, was 5 minutes. Now, similar to sauna, you cannot really do much in this time. You maybe can listen to audiobooks or read, for example, if you have your hands or if you have something in front of you. But you could also use it instead of having a separate meditating time slot and a separate sauna or cold plunge time slot, and combine these two, because you're not doing much anyway. The problem is just that, at least in the cold plunge, the neocortex seems to kind of shut down, at least if I understood that correctly, as Andrew Huberman explained it. So obviously I do not really need a calculator to calculate 10 minutes every single day. It would result in 50 days. So within about 1.5 months, you would be able to lose 1 kilogram of fat. Now, this is only the direct heating effect. Of course, you get also out of the tub probably afterwards. And now there are already a few people that recommend that you should maybe then dry off and let the heat from your skin basically evaporate, or the water from your skin evaporate, and therefore it again basically needs heat production from your skin, and the heat obviously also needs to come from somewhere, maybe the fat cells again. In addition, there might be other effects too. If you jump into a cold plunge once a day, for example, you have higher levels, at least for a certain amount of time afterwards, maybe up to 4 or 5 hours, at least according to Andrew Huberman, again, as I remember. And if you have higher levels of adrenaline, of dopamine, then you might also be prone to move just a little bit more. So you might also lose many calories in this regard, or a few calories in this regard. What we took a look at is just how much is transferred from this one box where you are in into this other box that is the cooling unit, and basically the fat is then evaporating into the air, or it is basically this here, this one tube that carries the hot water into the other one is basically transporting your fat weight in terms of energy. Now there are a few other factors we need, I think, to discuss. So what is often mentioned as a safe fat loss rate or weight loss rate is about 10% per week, or a 10% caloric reduction is often also mentioned per week, which is already kind of on the maximum side. On the minimum side, what is often cited, at least as I can remember, is about 5%. So a 5% per caloric reduction would probably not be that much. A 10% caloric reduction in a given week, for example, or just, I mean, caloric reduction is also just a rate, because every single day, the time you eat a certain amount of calories. If you reduce your calories by 10%, then obviously it's the rate of caloric intake, no matter the unit of time, because it's a rate already. So now one problem seems to be if the rate of attempted caloric reduction or fat reduction is too high, or also weight reduction for that matter, if we assume the weight reduction only comes from a reduction in fat and not from organ tissue or bone tissue or muscle tissue, which also obviously can be lost, then of course the muscle tissue is the one that can be lost the easiest, probably not the other one so much. But if we now assume these two values and we exceed these rates, these safe rates, then the body's homeostasis over time seems to be thrown off, and the body seems to want to go back to the set point it had established earlier. So if you lived for 10 years at a certain weight with a certain amount of fat, then the body already optimized all the processes. And if you now take out fat from the equation, then the body might have just, for example, if you just usually move your arm like this, and then you have 10% less weight because there is 10% less subcutaneous fat in your arm, then the movement pattern is differently. This is just an example, one example that might have not very negative effects, but this already might influence how you then feel and act, and also you might not feel like yourself because your movements are kind of different, because your body needs to basically recalculate all these different things. Now, obviously, the question is, can you just put one human into this box without dying, and at which rate, at which heat transfer rate can you put them in there and just lose them weight for infinity, and then just put them out again and they are basically thinner? Now, of course, the skin also needs to adapt. Now, if we have subcutaneous fat, then of course the skin needs to enlarge if there is more fat. So this needs also be accounted for. And in general, I think it should be assumed that maybe a caloric reduction or also a reduction of fat at 5% maybe, or just a caloric reduction of 5%, because this obviously does not transfer or convert into a fat reduction or weight reduction of 5% in a given day. So if we assume these safe rates, if we just assume the 5%, then of course the whole thing would have to be done in a way that is actually similar to the 5%. But if we already established that it would take at 1000 watts and 1 kilogram of fat to lose at 100 kilograms, even though the base weight in this regard doesn't really matter, it was just because it wasn't very nice because of the 1%, then it already resulted in 50 days. So it would not basically interfere too much with this 10% reduction. Often cited as also maybe 0.5 kilograms per week in MyFitnessPal, for example, as a safe rate, or up to 1 kilogram per week of weight loss in this regard, would also be considered maybe still safe, but also in the edge of what is possible. So the more you go onto the edge, maybe onto the 10% of caloric reduction, the more you basically seem to trigger kind of a yo-yo response that then would lead to you gaining back the weight and then gaining it and then trying to fight it off and then gaining it back. So basically a sinus curve until infinity. But if we take now a look at the other options that are currently available, the biggest thing is obviously that it needs to be a very good lifestyle intervention. It needs to be a multitude of factors that then eventually leads to you kind of having a different life. So if we assume that your current body is basically just an adaptation to whatever, or at least to a certain degree, not in an evolutionary sense, but in the sense what your body actually can adapt. You cannot grow like a giraffe to a higher tree and then eat from a higher tree, like Lamarck, for example, said giraffes would maybe be able to, but you can adapt, obviously, to a certain extent. So if we just assume this is you, and you are comparably thin, and don't have a lot of muscle, maybe also, doesn't really matter, then you, as you are, your body is basically a function of all the different things you do, or did historically. So now, of course, there are a few things that are constrained, like your bones, your genes, your height, but your height might also be a little bit variable. Maybe if you eat a little bit better food, then you might have grown, or if you ate when growing up a little bit better food, then you might have grown, or if you slept a little bit differently, then the discs in your vertebra, in your spinal cord, basically might have grown a little bit bigger, or not grown a little bit bigger, but might not be compressed as much as somebody who sleeps in a different position. So if we just assume that your current body, out of the things that are fixed and out of the things that are malleable, is just a function of your behavior, then obviously you need to change your behavior. That then would result in a different body. So over the time course of a given week, for example, if you overeat 10% of calories, then obviously this would over time result in a weight that goes up in terms of fat weight, if it is stored in fat weight. Now, if over time you tend to lose calories, so you have basically a caloric deficit, then your fat weight, if it is the only thing that adapts, can go down. Now, ideally you want to have maintenance. So the maintenance thing is basically the thing you need to do so you need to have the maintenance behaviors. So maybe that's training every single day, maybe that's training strength 3 times a week, and all these behaviors then lead to you having the certain body you then want to have. Now, of course, people differ a lot, and some people might be prone more to having more body fat, some people might be prone more to having less body fat, just from their genes or also from the things that are learned. So is it nurture or nurture? And obviously the question is, how much can you influence the whole thing? So where cold therapy might find a place is just as an additional behavior that also has other benefits, such as the rise in dopamine and adrenaline, at least for a short period of time, and maybe also other health benefits. And it might just be one of these layers which you can, or one of these levers you can actually use as part of a healthy lifestyle that then again and again results in a body that is actually maybe optimal and not has 1 kilogram or 10 kilograms or more fat that is too much in this body. In terms of what is the limit again? What is the limit of, if you were just put into ice cold water, then the limit seems to be usually. So, of course, there are 2 things now to consider. The maximum rate of heat production and maybe also a few other things. But if you assume all other functions of the body are kind of provided for, so if you need electrolytes, maybe you get electrolytes. If you need something else that is really crucial, of course you also need to sleep in a certain frequency, and so on and so forth. But let's just say we would be able to put people into this somewhat comfortably for 2 hours. Maybe it would be somewhat uncomfortable, but it would at least not result in any severe damages. And the person also would choose to do so, because maybe the other options would be, apart from a very complex lifestyle intervention that would maybe take years to implement, because the identity of the person then maybe also needs to change, or it needs to change before, and so on and so forth. So maybe, apart from taking the human stomach, so what is done, at least to my understanding, usually in a stomach size reduction, is that you just take the stomach and then you just put basically a string on here, and then the stomach is just smaller. And now, for example, this would be the stomach that is left. And this obviously is a very huge intervention. And then you can only eat up to then, because the stomach only can stretch so much, and then you are at least physically full. You just cannot eat anymore, because otherwise your stomach will hurt too much, I guess. So if you compare this to something like this, then maybe having to be in for 2 hours in cold water, obviously maybe there needs to be a build-up phase in terms of the brown fat or converting beige to brown fat, and maybe it takes a year a year of first cold showers and then maybe 30-second cold plunges and so on and so forth. But over this year, you also are using already the cold therapy in order to increase your basically caloric need in a given day. So another thing about the caloric need is obviously it's not only the energy you get from food, but it's also a lot of other things. So if you have a certain budget of calories, then there is, if let's just say there are a certain amount of the budget of calories is nutrients. So now if you eat, let's say 3,000 calories compared to 2,000 calories of food, then of course the factor here is 1.5, and if the factor here is 1.5, then you also have 1.5 as much or 50% more of all the other micronutrients. So more vitamin A, more vitamin D, if we assume the nutrition otherwise is fixed. And this is also possibly a factor because this decreases the risk of certain deficiencies. So the less the caloric intake is, and of course the caloric intake needs to ideally result in the caloric expenditure or need in a given day, and everything else will be stored as fat or will maybe also induce additional movement that is not controlled consciously. So let's just cut it down. Maybe a very simple thing would be this. If you, instead of taking the 10 minutes we discussed, you just take 1 minute. And the 10 minutes, obviously 10 minutes daily at 1000 watts, we just assumed that, would result in a fat loss of 1 kilogram per 50 days, or let's just say it's for 1 month, approximately 0.5 kilograms. 0.5 kilograms of fat. So if we just then cut this into 10, so you expose yourself to cold water for 1 minute. That's actually the protocol I did. Sometimes twice a day for 1 minute, but usually just once a day, at least in winter, at least in the last winter. Now what I did here is I then triggered basically if this was all true and so on and so forth. And obviously, not obviously. So now instead of the 0.5 kilograms, so 500 grams, we would then have 50 grams or 0.0. I actually am doing these because I'm European, so for euros. For the American guys, it would be points here. It would result in a fat loss of 50 grams if you just decreased the amount of minutes by 10. So 50 grams per month of fat loss. If you put yourself into 1 minute of cold immersion at all the things we assumed, then the 50 grams of fat loss might seem not that much, but over a given year, if you just add the 1 minute of cold exposure, and let's just assume it is very convenient. It is maybe close to your home gym. After your home gym, it is already set up and you jump in there for 1 minute, or before the shower. Then it is only 1 minute. This costs you in total, in terms of time, 360 minutes a year. This could be used for meditation. 360 minutes is only 6 hours, obviously. So the 6 hours of time investment in a given year, if we just assume the primary time of you being in a tub, would result in 50 multiplied by 12, which equals 600 grams of fat loss. It's not that much, but if you just implement this for the rest of your life, then you lose 600 grams of fat, or you could eat that much more.